During the 1800s and early 1900s, America was ravaged by a deadly disease known by many as the White Death, tuberculosis. This terrifying and very well contagious plague, for which no cure existed, claimed entire families and sometimes entire towns. In 1900, Louisville, Kentucky had the highest tuberculosis death rate in America. Built on low swampland, the area was the perfect breeding ground for a disease, and in 1910, a hospital was constructed on a windswept hill in southern Jefferson County that had been designed to combat the horrific disease. The disease continued to run rampant through the region, and eventually, with donations of money and land, a new hospital was started in 1924. The new structure, known as Waverly Hills, opened 2 years later in 1926. It was considered the most advanced tuberculosis syndrome in the country, but even then, most of the patients succumbed to the disease. There was no medicine available at the time to treat the disease, and so many patients were offered rest, fresh air, and lots of nutritious food. Sadly, the main use for the hospital was to isolate those who had come down with the disease and to keep them away from those who had not. Families were tragically divided with parents, and even children were forced into the syndrome with little contact with their loved ones. Treatments for tuberculosis were sometimes as bad as the disease itself. Some of the experiments that were conducted in search of a cure seemed barbaric by today's standards, but others are now common practice. Patients' lungs were exposed to ultraviolet light to try and stop the spread of bacteria. This was done in sunrooms, using artificial light in place of sunlight, or on the roof, or open porches of the hospital. Since fresh air was thought to also be a possible cure, patients were often placed in front of huge windows or on the open porches, no matter what the season was. Old photographs show patients lounging in chairs, taking in the fresh air while covered with snow. Other treatments were less pleasant and much bloodier. Balloons would be surgically implanted in the lungs and then filled with air to expand them. Needless to say, this often had disastrous results, as in an operation where muscles and ribs were removed from a patient's chest to allow the lungs to expand further and let in more oxygen. This blood-soaked procedure was seen as a last resort, and many patients did not survive it. While the patients who survived both the disease and the treatments left Waverly Hills through the front door, many others left through what came to be known as the body chute. This enclosed tunnel for the dead led from the hospital to the railroad tracks at the bottom of the hill. Using a motorside rail and a cable system, the bodies were lowered in secret to the waiting trains. This was done so that the patients would not see how many were leaving the hospital as corpses. Their mental health, the doctors believed, was just as important as their physical health. There are many inaccurate reports as to how many people died during Waverly Hills' decades of operation. Some claim that tens of thousands died with the walls of the hospital, but this number is greatly extracted. According to Dr. J. Frank Stewart, a former assistant medical director at the hospital, the highest number of death rate to occur at Waverly Hills in a single year was 152. By 1955, those numbers had dropped to as low as 42 deaths, and it's been estimated that approximately 6,000 people died there. Now, dating all the way back to the original hospital records from 1911, while far short of the numbers being tossed about in the legends, it's still a treacherous number of deaths to have occurred in a single structure. By the late 1930s, tuberculosis had begun to decline around the world, and by 1943, new medicines had largely in the United States. A small jump in new cases did occur after World War II, and many soldiers returning from the war were housed at Waverly Hills. Dr. Stewart noted in his autobiography that many of the soldiers had cases that were so advanced that they did not live for more than a week after arriving at the hospital. In 1961, Waverly Hills was closed down but was reopened a year later as Woodhaven Sanandrum. There have been many rumors and stories about patients' mistreatment and unusual experiments during the years that the building was used as an old age home. Some of them have been proven to be false, while others have unfortunately turned out to be true. Electroshock therapy, which was considered to be highly effective in those days, was widely used for a variety of elements. Budget cuts in the 1960s and the 1970s led to both horrible conditions and patient mistreatments, and in 1982, the state closed the facility for good. Is any wonder, after all the death, pain, and agony within these walls, that Waverly Hills is considered to be one of the most haunted places in the country? Well, the building and land were auctioned off and changed hands many times over the courses of the next 2 decades. In 1983, a developer purchased the property with plans to turn it into a minimum security prison for the state of Kentucky. Plans were dropped after neighbors protested, and the new idea to turn the former hospital into apartments was devised. A lack of financing caused this plan to be abandoned. In March of 1996, Waverly Hills and the surrounding land was bought by Robert Elborowski, who ran Christ the Redeemer Foundation Inc. He had plans to construct the world's tallest statue of Jesus on the Waverly site, along with an art and a worship center. The statue, which was inspired by the famed Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro, was to be situated on the roof of the hospital at a cost about $4 million. The next phase of his plan was to convert the Sanandrum into a chapel, theater, and gift shop for another $8 million. Not surprisingly, donations to the project fell far short of what was expected. During the first year, only $3,000 was raised towards the effort, and the project was cancelled in December of 1997. Elborowski abandoned the Waverly Hills property and then, in order to recoup some of his costs, tried to have the property condemned so that the building could be torn down and redeveloped. This plan was blocked by the county, and according to rumor, demolition work was then done around the southern edge of the building in order to undermine the structural foundations and collect insurance money. This scheme also failed, and in 2001, Waverly Hills was sold to Charlie and Tina Mattingly, the current owners of the property. By 2001, the once stately building had been nearly destroyed by then. The elements and the vandals who came here looking for a thrill, Waverly Hills had become the local haunted house, and it became a magnet for the homeless, looking for shelter, and teenagers who broke in looking for ghosts. The hospital soon gained a reputation for being haunted, and stories began to circulate of resident ghosts like the little girl who was seen running up and down the third floor Soul Room. The little boy who was spotted with a leather ball. The hearers that appeared in the back of the building dropping off coffins. The woman that with the bleeding wrists who cried for help, and others. Visitors told of slamming doors, lights in the windows as if the power was still running through the building, strange sounds and eerie footsteps in empty rooms. Other legends told of a man in a white coat who was seen walking in the kitchen and the smell of cooking food that sometimes wafted through the room. The kitchen was a disaster. A ruin of broken windows, fallen plaster, broken tables and chairs, and a puddle of water and debris that resulted from a leaking roof. The cafeteria had not fared much better. Even so, a number of people had reported footsteps in the room, a door swinging shut under its own power, and the smell of fresh baked bread in the air. Perhaps the greatest and the most controversial legend of Waverly Hills was connected to the 5th floor of the building. This floor of the old hospital consisted of 2 nurse stations, a pantry, a linen room, medicine room, and 2 medium-sized rooms on both sides of the 2 nurse stations. One of these rooms, room 502, is the subject of many rumors and legends, and just about every curiosity seeker that had broken into Waverly Hills over the years and wanted to see it. This is where, according to the stories, people have seen shapes moving in the windows, have heard disembodied voices, and if the legends are to be believed, have even jumped to their deaths. There are a lot of legends about what went down in this part of the hospital, but perhaps the biggest misconception was that this was a floor used to house mentally ill tuberculosis patients. This was not the case. The patients here were not insane, nor were they conflicted with their rooms. They were free to move about, just like patients on all of the other floors of the hospital. This floor, thanks to its design, allowed patients to still benefit from the fresh air and sunshine that was believed to cure, or at least extend the life of those with the disease. It was centered in the middle of the hospital, and the 2 wards extended out from the nurse station were glassed in all sides and opened out onto a patio-type roof. According to the stories, a nurse was found dead in room 502 in 1928. She had committed suicide by hanging herself from the light fixture. She was 29 years old at the time of her death, unmarried and pregnant. Her depression over the situation led her to take her own life. It's unknown how long she may have been hanging in this room before her body was discovered. And this would not be the only tragedy to occur with the connection to room 502. In 1932, another nurse who worked in the same room jumped from the roof patio and plunged several stories to her death. No one seemed to know why she would have done this, but many have speculated that she may have actually have been pushed over the edge. There are no records to indicate this, but rumors continued to pierced. Those are the stories anyways. As with so many legends, no records exist to say that any of this actually happened. There are also conflicting accounts as to how the woman managed to hang herself. Some say that she did it from the lights fixture, others from a pipe over the door, and some say from the rafters. There are no rafters. A pipe over the door was part of a sprinkler system installed in 1972, and the light fixture is hung on a light decorative chain that would not have held the weight of a person. There is no actual documentation of either death, although some claim the stories were verified by a former staff member, John Thornberry, who died in 2006. According to obituary, he was born in 1922, which would have made him 6 and 10 years old at the time of the alleged deaths that were connected to room 502. This makes his verification more than a little problematic. So, what happened in room 502 that could cause so many people to claim paranormal experiences there? Overreactive imaginations? Or is something real? Needless to say, it's hard, but it seems likely that something occurred in the room to cause the legend to take rot in the first place. What that may have been, no one knows. The story of room 502 may have been loosely based on some forgotten facts, but the truth remains buried under all of the speculations and rumors. In spite of this, strange things continue to be reported. Over the course of the next year, volunteers working towards the restoration of the building experienced ghostly sounds. They heard slamming doors. They even saw lights appear in the building when there should have been none. They heard objects being thrown at them. They were struck by unseen hands. Saw appearances in the doorway, in corridors, and more. But none of the stories that I had been told could have ever prepared me for my first visit in Waverly Hills. The first time that I visited the hospital was in September 2002. I was in town for a convention, and a friend of mine who had been working with the owners at Waverly Hills. They offered to take me to see the place that I had been hearing a lot about. At that point, the old hospital had been open for tours, but had not reached the level of infamy that is today. There had been no TV shows, books, or websites dedicated to those in those days. It was literally a dark and stormy night when we arrived at the hospital, and it had been raining all day. I was looking forward to seeing the place no matter what the weather, and not because I was convinced that I would meet one of the former patients face to face. It was simply to experience the place for myself. By this time, I had traveled all over the country and had been to hundreds of places that were alleged to be haunted. I had felt the same way before exploring all of them, so Waverly Hills was no different to me. It was just an old, spooky building with history. The fact that it was alleged to be haunted simply added to the experience. I had long since abandoned the idea of expecting too much. After meeting with the owners, we went inside and started exploring the building. The building was almost silent. All that I could hear was the sound of our own footsteps, our hushed voices, and the drip of rain as it slipped through the cracks in the roof and splashed down onto the ground. I was given the full guided tour and saw various rooms, the treatment areas, the kitchen, morgue, and on and on. We climbed the stairs to the top floor. Then I saw the legendary room 502, as well as the lights of Louisville as they reflected off the low and ominous looking clouds that had gathered above the city. The only floor that we skipped over was the fourth, but my friend explained that this was the only floor in the building for which the entrance was kept locked and he had saved it for last. When we finally arrived on the fourth floor, I got the distant feeling that something strange was in the air. I make absolutely no claims of any civic ability whatsoever, but there was just something about this floor of the hospital that felt different than any of the others. What had been nothing more than just an old, ramshackle and broken down building suddenly seemed really, really different. I can't really put into words what felt so strange about it, but it almost seemed to be a presence that I had not encountered anywhere else in the place. And right away, eerie things started to happen. We had entered the floor in what I believe was the center of the building. Behind us was a wing that I was told was not safe to enter. Sections of the floor had fallen in, and this area was off limits to the tours and visitors. The strange thing about it was that both of us clearly heard the sounds of doors slamming from part of the building. I can assure the reader that it was not the wind either. The wind was not strong enough that night to have moved those heavy doors, and this clearly sounded as though someone was closing them very hard. When I questioned my friend about who else could be up there with us, he explained to me about how unsafe the floors were in that section. I investigated on my own and determined that he was correct. There was no one walking around in that part of the fourth floor. I switched off my flashlight and we walked down the corridor using only the dim, immediate light from outside. The hallway runs through the center of the building, and on either side of it are former patient rooms. Beyond the rooms is the porch area that opens to the outside. It was there where the patients were placed to take in the fresh air. There was no glass ever placed in the huge outer windows, which has left the interior of the floor open to the elements ever since. On this night, the windows also illuminated the corridor. Thanks to the low-hanging clouds that glowed with the light of Louisville, we walked down through the dark and murky corridor, and I began to see shadows that flickered back and forth. I was sure that this was trick of an eye, though likely caused by the light or the wind moving something outside. But this was where the corridor angled to the right, and I got a look at something that was definitely not a trick of the eye. In order for the reader to understand what I saw, I have to explain that the hallway ahead of us continued straight for a short distance and then turned sharply to the right. In the early 1900s, most intentions of this type were designed in this manner. It was what was dubbed the Batwing design, which meant that there was a main center in each building, and then the wing extended right and left, then angled again, so that they ran slightly backward like a bird or bat wings. Directly at the angle ahead of us was a doorway that led into the treatment room. I only noticed the doorway in the darkness because of the dim light from the windows, beyond it had caused it to glow slightly. This made it impossible to miss since it was straight ahead of us. We took a few more steps and then, without warning, the clear and distant silhouette of a man crossed the lighted doorway, passed into the hall, and then vanished into a room on the other side of the corridor. I got a distant look at the figure, and I know it was a man, and that he was wearing what appeared to be a long, white drape that could have been a doctor's coat. The sighting only lasted a few seconds, but I knew what I had seen. And for some reason, it shook and startled me so badly that I let out a yell and grabbed a hold of my friend's jacket. I am not sure why it affected me in that way, but perhaps in what setting, the figure's sudden appearances, my own anxiety, or likely all those things. Regardless, after my yell, I demanded that he turn on a light and help me to examine the room that the man had vanished into. After my initial fright, I became convinced that someone else was in the floor with us. My friend assured me we were the only ones there, but he did help me search for the intruder. In an empty room with only one way in or out, there was no one there. Whoever that figure had been, he had early and completely vanished. I doubt that I was the first person to see this mystery appearance on the 4th floor, and it's unlikely that I will be the last. However, this sighting put Waverly Hills into a unique category for me that I will firmly state that I believe it is haunted. Usually, for me to do that, I must have my own unexplainable experience that goes beyond a mere bump in the night or spooky photograph. In this case, I actually seen a ghost, and at the time, I could count the ghost sighting that I had on 2 fingers. Waverly Hills is haunted for me. Seeing what was believed.